Now we will be talking about the biography of Venedikt Erofeev. Erofeev himself had described his life in part. The autobiography composed by the writer had survived. Let's read the first lines of it. Erofeev, Venedikt Vasilievich, born October 24, 1938, on the Kola Peninsula, beyond the Arctic Circle. For the first time in his life, he crossed the Arctic Circle from north to south, of course, when after graduating with honors at the age of 17, he went to the capital upon getting into Moscow University. In fact, beyond these short lines of almost official documentation, the real events are almost not visible. Erofeev was actually born into a family of 3 children. He was the youngest of them, and his father in 1946 was convicted for recounting the political anecdote for anti-Soviet propaganda and spent about 7 years in the labor camp. His mother could not take care of all the children, and she had to hand over 2 boys to an orphanage. So the childhood of Erofeev cannot be called happy. But already in his early years, he already showed great abilities, above all magnificent memory. His sister remembered that he knew by heart the Tirov calendar, with all its poems, culinary recipes, biographies of famous people, dates, and so on. A large variety of texts in the Tirov calendar. He could read all that by heart. He also knew by heart the works of Lenin, and it would affect his works later. In the 70s he compiled a funny book of Lenin's quotations, named it My Little Leniniana. He indeed graduated from school with the gold medal, with honors, but biographers note another important detail, almost impossible for a Soviet citizen. Erofeev was never a pioneer or a Komsomol member, a Young Communist League member, although everybody were obliged to enter these organizations. And as it is said in his autobiography, he crossed the Arctic Circle, went to Moscow, got into Moscow State University in the Faculty of Philology, or Literature and Language Faculty. It was in 1955, in the first post-Stalin era years. It was a very good golden time in the history of Moscow State University. Many distinguished academics, professors worked there in that times. And Erofeev, in the terms of his character, was of course a literary man. He was primarily interested by literature. He remembered it easily and could cite a lot, but nevertheless he did not become a literary scholar. He was expelled from the university after the 3rd semester because he did not find a common language with the military department. Military education was a part of general education. It was obligatory for all male students of the universities at that time. He could not march in cadence and obey the silly orders of the officers. From his studies in the Moscow University, he kept only relations with some friends, including the famous translator of Tolkien into Russian, Vladimir Muravyev, to whom the tragedy Walpurgis Night was dedicated later. In the long term, Venedikt Erofeev's whole life was an attempt to complete his studies and to teach himself. Reading his notebooks, which are well preserved but not fully published yet, reading of his notebooks convinces that he read practically everything, from the church fathers to second and third-rate poets of the 19th century, who had been long forgotten by everyone. He got entered and almost immediately expelled from many provincial universities. 4 universities in Russia can pride themselves for expelling the future writer from their ranks. In the 60s, Erofeev got married. He had a son, also called Venedikt, and to his wife and son the poem Moscow Petushki, or Moscow to the End of the Line, would be dedicated. Actually, the trip to them is described in this poem. They lived in the village in the Vladimir region, not far from Moscow. But actually he had already broke up with his family by the time the poem was finished. And Erofeev was working constantly. In his memoirs, about 30 positions, 30 jobs in different fields were listed. Just where he did not work: the porter in the grocery store, a bricklayer in the construction, a boilerman, a police department sentry, an employee responsible for bottle return, a librarian, a collector of geophysical expedition, and so on. The only work, Erofeev informs ironically, which came to his heart was in 1974 in the Hungry steppe in Uzbekistan, working in a parasitological expedition as a laboratory assistant to fight the winged blood-sucking midge. Midge in Russian sounds like scoundrels, and the whole Erofeev is in this oxymoronic expression, winged blood-sucking scoundrels. He always combined the incompatible, high and low, winged with midge, winged with scoundrels. This is his literary handwriting. However, the enumeration of these jobs, these images of Erofeev, could be misleading. There was no socialization in his life. In fact, despite all these jobs, he remained a deeply antisocial person. This is recalled by one of his close friends, Igor Avdiev. Venedikt, for 17 years, did not have a residence permit for a specific address. These documents, the residence permit, was the very important one. A person who did not have this document, in fact, had no rights in the Soviet society. And in 1975, after 20 years after his expulsion from Moscow State University, he came to the military office to get a military registration, which was also the most important document for a Soviet citizen. So he was a man who existed, as it were, completely outside the state, without any connection with it. And it was the part of his image and his outlook. As for his writings, Erofeev himself recalls that he began to write from the age of 5. However, practically all that have been written before the year 1969, before the poem Moscow Petushki, was not preserved. There were some notes of the psychopath written back in the 50s. There was some big text which was called Good News. This title, by the way, is very characteristic for Erofeev because it is nothing else like a translation of the Greek word Gospels. And all that was lost. Therefore, when the poem was written and published, it was an impression that he was a genius arising from nothing. After the poem he became famous, but it was a fame in narrow circles. It was a long time before official publication had come. And we will talk about the poem separately. When they say that Erofeev is the author of only one book of this poem, this is true and not true. There are at least 2 more works worth mentioning, although they are hardly comparable with Moscow to the End of the Line. First is a small essay which is called Vasily Rozanov Through the Eyes of an Eccentric. Vasily Rozanov was a controversial publicist and essayist of the early 20th century, also mixing high and low themes and high and low words in his works. And he was the favorite author of Erofeev. And second is the tragedy named Walpurgis Night, which was conceived as a first part of a trilogy, which for some reason he named in German, Drei Nächte, and in which he could only write the first part. The tragedy Walpurgis Night was written in 1985. Like everything Erofeev wrote, it was written immediately, without preparation, in a few weeks. It was staged in the theater, and the author even managed to attend the premiere. The play had some success at that time. Oddly enough, the avant-garde innovator, the postmodernist Erofeev, the violator of all the rules and frontiers, preserved all classical tragedy rules, namely the unity of place, time, and action. At the same time, all of them, especially the unity of action, are not so much classical. The action takes place in a mental asylum, where the main hero, the drunk middle-aged Jewish man Lev Gurevich, was convicted. He is a multidimensional man, a complicated man, and in many respects reminds Erofeev himself. He is a wise man, he is a Don Juan, he is a good speaker who can talk on every topic fluently and easily. He is a phrasemonger, a philosopher, and so on. This drunken buffoonery in combination with lyrical outpouring is the essence of his monologues, which are of the primary interest in the tragedy. The characters in the tragedy, the patients, arrange a tribunal of their own over one of their colleagues, one of the patients of the mental asylum. And in the end, they all die by drinking methanol, while celebrating the eve of the May 1st, which is simultaneously the day of international solidarity of workers and a Walpurgis Night. Like in a classic Shakespearean tragedy, the scene at the end is filled with corpses, and Gurevich turns out to be guilty. There's also a theme of confrontation with power, which is embodied by the nurse, Boris, nicknamed the Enforcer. This is the last work of Erofeev, if we do not count notebooks and diaries which he kept all his life, till the very end. In his last years, he was seriously ill, as I have said. After several operations, he had lost his voice, the ability to speak. During the perestroika, Moscow to the End of the Line and other texts by Erofeev were printed. The fame came to him, now not in the narrow circles but nationwide. He turned out to be needed by everyone. He was endlessly interviewed and invited to television and so on. And at the peak of this glory, on May 11, 1990, on Friday, Erofeev died from throat cancer.